I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what happens to the heifer once she leaves the hutch or your housing system in which you had milk feeding. Okay? So these are data collected over numerous dairy farms and heifer raising facilities, just to illustrate where you spend most of the money to raise a heifer. And to no surprise, it's no different than producing milk. The biggest expense is feed ingredient. Okay, so it's basically feeding and the associated aspects with diet is where most of the cost, whether you're talking about dairy herds that raise replacements or heifer raising facilities that do that as a contract. You know, heifer raising facilities spend a little bit less because they can potentially be more efficient, or they may use cheaper ingredients. But the bottom line is that more than half of the cost is associated with feeding. The issue here is that for a lot of producers, you don't see any return unless you sell a heifer or you wait until 24 months of age. Yeah? So you make an investment, and for a lot of people that is seen as an expense for something that will only come back 24 months later, and it's going to take another 12 months until she pays back all the investment that you put in that first lactation, which will on that first 2 years of life. Okay. Now, if you look at U.S. statistics, these are practices that occur in very small herds, fewer than 30 cows, and larger herds, over 500 cows. This is the replacement of animals per year on dairy farms in the U.S. The values here, for those who cannot see, we are at 24.9% in the small herds. In other words, the average lactation, number of lactations on those herds will be about 4, whereas in the larger herds, the replacement a year, which is a combination of mortality, which in the U.S. averages at about 6% a year, and replacement because of culling, it's averaging about 34%. The overall, the industry is 33%. Our cow inventory is about 9.3 million dairy cows. And the heifer inventory is a little bit harder to get this information because the way it gets collected is based on weight, and it starts at about 500 pounds. But we have about 4.9 million heifers with over 500 pounds. And our average of first calving is 25 months. So if you do the math, with a yearly replacement of 32.5, we're going to have an average number of lactations of almost 3, which means that with the current calving interval, which is 401 days of the U.S. industry, we're going to have the mean lifespan of a dairy cow of a little over 64 months. So if you look at that non-productive period of growth of the animal, that represents almost 40%. So 40% of the life of that cow is spent in the period that she doesn't generate any income unless you sell her. And I think that's part of the reason why many people end up neglecting heifers during their development, because they don't see an immediate return. Okay? A good analogy is that you work for a dairy producer and something gets changed and milk production drops. What happens? You get a phone call, yeah? And there will be a complaint because you lost 4 pounds of milk and you told them, or you made a recommendation, or you made a decision on the farm. Now you change heifer management. How long does it take until you see whether you made a good decision or a bad decision? Particularly in the post-wean period. It takes a month or so, maybe a couple of months, until you see whether your heifers are gaining less weight or more weight, or they're not growing as fast. So it's not a very dynamic system. Okay? So we are not as sensitive as, for example, for milk yield. So some of the objectives of heifer rearing programs, and we can debate whether they are perfect objectives, but they're sort of guidelines. But one of them, I think it applies to almost any farm, is that we want to have very low morbidity and mortality. Okay? The national average for mortality is approximately 6.5%. okay, during the pre-weaning period, where it's the highest risk. But we want to have low incidence of disease other than just a mild diarrhea. We want to have low incidence of mortality. We want to double body weight by about 60 or 65 days. Do we need to double body weight on every animal? Perhaps not, but that is a very good indication that if you're not overfeeding milk, you're not having a lot of disease. Okay? So if you feed reasonable amounts of milk and you are able to double body weight by 60 or 65 days, that's a very good thermometer that you don't have excessive amounts of really bad diarrhea or respiratory problems. You want heifers to reach puberty, which typically happens at about 45% of the mature weight for the breed. If you have big Holsteins, it's going to be at a different body weight than if you have small Holsteins. Okay? So for a given breed, the size of the genotype influences typically when they achieve puberty. But you don't want to breed them when they achieve puberty. So this would be equivalent of a heifer weighing 600 and some pounds. You want to wait a few cycles so fertility of the animal is maximized. And usually it takes about 2 or 3 estrus cycles after puberty for you to achieve high pregnancy. If you look at experiments that people bred heifers on their very first cycle, pregnancy to an insemination was typically in the 20 to 30%, whereas you can easily get Holstein heifers to get 60 to 65% pregnancy without a lot of effort. Okay? We want to have a average weight for those animals because there is a certain pattern of growth that we want to achieve if you want to have adequate weight at calving, which dictates how much milk potential those heifers have. Okay? We want to achieve adequate development at calving. So typically, we want to achieve about 90% of the mature weight of the animal immediately preceding calving. So for the typical Holstein, she will be weighing about 1350 before calving, unless you have really large frame Canadian type of cattle. But if hopefully you're not going that direction, and I'll show you later why you should not go in that direction. But typically those heifers before calving, they will be about 1350. You have to remember, we usually give average values. Yeah? There's a distribution around that value. And there will be, unfortunately, many heifers that don't achieve those minimum guidelines. Yeah? And you want to obtain those results at an early age without compromising mammary development. And I'll show you some data on that, that if you get very aggressive, you're going to spend more money and you will get less milk. And obviously, you want to do this in an economic manner. Okay? So you don't want to do things just because you feel better. It's probably because there is, within some constraints, there is an economic advantage. So what do good farms get from going from 0.1 to 0.4? And I'm going to show you data from 3 farms that I collect recently in terms of what numbers they achieve. Of all the females born, about 98% are born alive. So they have 2% stillbirth in female heifers. These are singleton females. Okay? So there's about 98% born alive, but there's another 2% that are pre-weaning. So by the time they get to the weaning period, they are weaning 96% of their females. Okay? So in the post-weaning period, either because of accidents or bad pneumonias, you get another 2% death until they get to the breeding group at about 12.5 to 13 months of age. So by the time they get here, we have about 94% of our potential replacement animals that are reaching the breeding stage, and they can contribute to the development of the herd. We don't want to keep every heifer that goes into the breeding period in the herd, and I know producers love their heifers and they have a hard time getting rid of them, but there are heifers that are not economically attractive. For instance, heifers that get pregnant 100 and 120 days after you begin breeding. Okay? So these producers here can get 94% of the heifers that are submitted to breeding pregnant within 80 days of a breeding period. So they move heifers at about 380, 400 days of age, and within 80 days of breeding, they get 94% of them pregnant. So by the time it's all said and done, of all the cows that had a heifer calf here, live or dead, we're going to retain potentially 86% of those that could actually contribute to the growth of the herd and become replacement animals. It might sound small number, but that's really what it is if you actually dig through your data. Okay? I'm not talking about live calves that are born. I'm talking about all the pregnancies that have a singleton calf that deliver a female animal, whether she was alive or dead. So by the time it's all said and done, we have about 86% of them remaining in the herd, as long as the producer didn't decide to sell animals in between here. Okay? So if we think about nutritional programs for dairy heifers, Judd already touched on this, and he talked extensively about colostrum and pre-weaning programs. I'm going to spend time on this portion here, and I'm not going to talk anything about close-up cows. So we could divide that post-weaning period into 3 phases. The first one is the transition period, which is, as he told us, is the cheapest period. And it is the cheapest period, and you will see why that is the cheapest one. Then we have the pre-pubertal, that there is a very interesting physiological phenomenon that takes place that if we don't respect, there may be some negative implications later on. And then there is the easy time, which is the post-pubertal period of feeding animals, feeding those heifers. Okay, so the transition period, the reason why it's the cheapest is because feed efficiency is quite high. Okay? Feed conversion ratio at this time is about 2 to 2.5 to 1 when you're feeding a high grain diet, meaning that it takes 2.5 pounds of feed for every pound of gain. Okay? You don't want to take advantage of that. But you can only achieve that if your calves are able to consume large quantities of grain. So if you transition them from a very high milk feeding into a grain diet, it's going to be very challenging for them to gain a lot of weight because they're not going to eat a lot of grain in that transition period. Okay? So calves at this point should be consuming approximately 6 pounds of dry matter by 90 days of age. And I'll show you some data on that. Okay? Group them in small groups, and it's just common sense. Small groups are a whole lot easier to spot sick animals, and it's a whole lot less likely to have intensive competition between calves and disease transmission. Large groups makes it more predisposed to disease transmission, competition, and it's a little bit harder for employees to spot calves immediately after they develop initial disease. So these are data from a little over 500 calves that we measured dry matter intake every day, and that was quite a bit of work. But you can see here, these calves are at 9 to 10 weeks of age. There are 2 treatments, it doesn't really matter. And you can see that this is grain dry matter, which means that if we were to think about grain itself, there would be another 15% of that. So these calves at about 10 weeks of age, 70 days of age, they're consuming about 6.5 pounds of grain, about 5.8 pounds of grain dry matter. But to do this, there was a plan that was taking place here of milk feeding to allow them to have high grain intake. Okay?
So on the previous slide, you said that the, not this slide, the slide before, that there's a 2 to 2.1% or conversion ratio.
Okay, yeah?
So that means that you're saying a calf is gaining 12 pounds of body mass a day by feeding it 6 pounds of grain?
In this period here,
yeah,
the calf is gaining about 1.2 to 1.3 kilos, so about 3 pounds per day when they're eating that 5.5 pounds of dry matter grain. Yeah, so they're gaining about 1.2 kilograms of body weight, so which is about 2.6 pounds of body weight. I don't know how much is lean mass. I'm assuming not a lot of that is just gut feel, but there may be some. And those calves are eating 5.8 pounds of dry matter, which is about 6 some pounds of grain as fed, because there's about 14% water in that grain. Okay? But that's a sort of transition. It's a short period of time that you should take advantage of that. Okay, once they go into a high forage diet, then feed efficiency really drops. And then you go to your typical 5, 6 to 1 once you get into whole TMR. So typical grain, as Judd already alluded, you don't want to pulverize your grain because the little fiber that calves need will come from the components that have high fiber here, such as the husk of oats, or if you have barley, or if you use cottonseed hulls here in the southeast, or in the kernels of corn that are steam rolled that have minimum particle size. Okay? So you don't want them to be powdery because that doesn't allow for stimulation of rumen contraction. So coarsely processed grains to preserve the fiber. Obviously, this post-wean grain should have adequate protein, and these early wean calves respond to high-quality protein. There's lots of data in literature with beef and dairy cattle showing that if you feed low-quality protein, I'll give you one example that may be relevant to you guys. You replace soybean meal with cottonseed meal, calves gain less weight. They gain less lean weight just because the quality of the protein is less. Okay? So some protein source that they have very low particular amino acids. So you feed corn-based proteins only. Corn gluten meal has very low lysine. Calves will grow less than if you were to feed a higher quality protein. So this is a period of time that if you feed very cheap protein sources, you will give up some lean development. Okay? And you need some fiber in there, which comes from either the grains that are high in fiber, or you may add some high fibrous byproduct there that can be incorporated into the grain. Watch out for excessive molasses. If you're making grain mix on your own farm, avoid excess, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that excessive molasses might reduce dry matter intake. It can cause rumen acidosis with a high grain diet, and that leads to production of byproducts that can cause what's called polyencephalomalacia. And this is not unusual. A calf that's eating 6 pounds of grain dry matter in a grain that has 8 or 10% molasses, you will get eventually animals that show blindness, they have neurological disease, and that is because sometimes molasses have very high sulfur content, and that becomes sulfhydric gas that affects the central nervous system. And make sure that all your grains have adequate amounts of ionophores to control coccidia, because anything that you do well with your calves before wean, and if they have a bout of coccidiosis after wean, you set them back, a week or so. That's part of it. It will also prevent bloat in high grain diets, and it will obviously improve feed efficiency. So there are good reasons why you want to have that, and most feed mills will do this. But if you're making grain on farm, make sure that your pellet that has the protein component includes the vitamins and minerals, but also has the ionophore. Whether it's monensin or Bovatec, it doesn't necessarily matter unless you're the guy selling it. But if you're not the one selling it, so it probably doesn't matter. So ionophores have the ability to control coccidia, which is this protozoa that is ubiquitous. It's present in soil. It's recycled through the gut of the calf. It's self-limiting, but these young animals are highly susceptible to that. And once they get infected by this oocysts, they sporulate within the GI tract, and they can contaminate and invade the epithelial cells of the intestine. But whether you use monensin or Bovatec or even other products that are non-ionophores, it will actually kill the coccidia either in the small intestine or in the large intestine, so it doesn't allow it to invade the animal's tissue. So that is part of the reason why it will improve feed efficiency. But the other one is because ionophores have the ability to induce a little bit of satiety, and there are reasons for that, probably relate to the byproducts of fermentation. So in general, it reduces dry matter intake. These are data that have been compiled from beef and dairy experiments. There's lots of experiments there. They're quite consistent. and the data is overwhelmingly positive. So you feed ionophore, animals eat a little less, and that's expected. They gain the same or gain more, therefore feed efficiency improves. You gain the same weight or more weight with the same amount of feed, or with less feed. Okay? So whether you use Rumensin 90 or Bovatek, feed efficiency is quite similar. It goes up about 5%, meaning that for the same gain, those animals consume less feed, or for the same feed, they actually gain more weight. And it's highly profitable. You're spending maybe 1 or 1.5 cents per day per calf, and you're getting back 10 to 15 cents per day per calf in terms of feed efficiency. So no questions about it. Prevents coccidiosis, better feed efficiency, and it's legal to do that. Okay, so now we get to that phase in which the calf passed through the transition period, and we're now feeding them on a TMR, and we want to get certain rate of growth in those animals. So we achieved whatever our targets are for development of the heifer before calving. But we have to think about the implications of that, not just in terms of growth of the body, but also implications for lactation. And mammary physiologists have categorized how the mammary gland develops in the bovine female, and it probably applies to other species as well. It's just that they don't have the same interest in terms of lactation biology. But there is development during fetal life in which the base structure, the stroma, that gives structure to the mammary gland, the blood vessels and the ducts develop. And then during the initial life of development, we have what's called the isometric phase, in which the somatic development in the animal and the development of the glandular tissue in the mammary gland is the same. So the deposition of cells in the mammary gland and the deposition of cells in other tissues are going in the same rate. So this is called isometric because iso means equal. Okay? But then we have an interesting phase that goes somewhere when animals are about 240, 250 pounds, all the way up to puberty. And I'm using here 9 months because we feed animals in a certain manner that most Holstein heifers will get into puberty starting somewhere in 8 to 9 months of age. Okay? And at this stage here, the rate of tissue deposition in the mammary gland is faster than in the rest of the body. So there is more cell proliferation, particularly in the glandular aspect, in the epithelial cell aspect in the mammary gland than there is into the rest of the somatic cells in the body. Okay? So that's called the allometric phase. So the mammary development occurs at a faster rate than other tissues in the body. Okay? And in this stage, there is deposition of fat in the fat pad in the mammary gland. There's also a formation of the mammary ducts. And that's where many of the milk secreting cells in the mammary gland, at least for the first lactation, will be established. So there is the life of the cow, there will be mammogenesis, and there will be death of cells depending upon what stage of the life cycle or the lactation she is. But in this stage, there is active proliferation and deposition of tissue that will determine the amount of milk secreting cells. And then once the animal gets exposed to the hormones that are produced by the ovaries, progesterone, estrogen, once that animal is pubertal, the rate of deposition of tissue slows down relative to what it was, okay? And it becomes again equal to the rest of the somatic cells in the body. So it goes back to that isometric phase here, okay? So the reason why I'm telling you all this story is because there are lots of good literature that I will show you some, and I'll show you a compilation of work that Jet has put together relative to how fast we should grow heifers when they are in that stage of 3 to 9, 10 months of age. But just for easy of thinking, will be after the transition all the way up to breeding, so we can speak easy implementation on farm. And there are sort of two schools in the literature. One is the school from the Danish. I have lots of really good data, and I'll show you some of that, in which if you make heifers grow too fast, Okay? During the allometric phase, mammary development is compromised and you lose milk in that first lactation. And then there is a US school, okay, that says that if I formulate diets properly, I can overcome that loss and I can make my heifers grow very fast and I can calve them earlier, which is an advantage because it costs me $2.20, $2.40 to feed a heifer when she is 23 months of age or so on. Okay? So if I formulate diets properly, I overcome the problem. That's sort of the story. So let's see if that's the case or not. Okay? So what the Danish showed with their cattle was that animals gaining for the genotype that they have, and I'll show you what those cattle were. If they gain more than 700 grams a day, which is about 1.7 pounds per day, 1.6, 1.7 pounds, they had reduced mammary parenchymal DNA, so less potential for milk secreting cells, and they lost milk yield in their first lactation, 10 to 20%. Okay? So you get less mammary development during that stage of development of the heifer, and when they become first lactation animals, they produce less milk. So the issue here is that the genotype that they use is quite different than what you have today in your farms. So let's look at two experiments here. So these are Jersey Danish cattle from the 80s and early 90s. So you can see that they are quite small cattle. They are 800 pounds, okay? 780 pounds, 800 pounds. These are Frisian, Danish Frisian cattle. You can see they are quite small relative to our Holstein cows. So they are about 1,000 to 1,100 pounds. These are the number of animals in each of those treatments. These are the average daily gains they impose to those animals. So they are gaining here about 0.8 pounds, 1.1 pound, 1.3 pounds per day. Or in the Frisians, they are gaining here 1.3 pounds all the way up to almost 2 pounds per day. Here is the milk production, and it's relative to the lowest gain, that's 100%. These animals are producing 11,000 pounds at 250 days. So these are smaller cattle, lower production. But look at what happened when they made them gain more weight in that phase of 3 to 9 months. They lost 20% of production in the first lactation. They lost about 2,300 pounds of milk. If they made that same change in the Frisian, they lost approximately 1,200 pounds of milk in that first lactation. The criticism to this is that these animals were fed very high energy diets with not very high protein. And to grow body in that stage of development, you need to add muscle, and for that you need amino acids. Yeah? So you need to have certain ratio of protein to energy to grow a heifer properly. So people thought, well, if we fix this, if we don't underfeed protein, we might be able to fix that. So here are some of the experiments that were done with potentially inadequate protein. That was the criticism relative to energy. So these diets that were fed in this and this and this experiment, they had a ratio of protein to energy that was this number here. Okay? So I don't want to get caught up in the number, but 55 grams of crude protein for every megacalorie. If they made heifers grow faster in that stage of life, they always had less mammary development. Okay? So if the diet in this case was high in energy, relatively low protein to the energy, and you made them grow faster between the transition and the breeding age, less mammary development. Then experiments were done in the US with US genetics, and they look at that. Okay? What if I have low average daily gain and my forage is high in protein, alfalfa? Okay? What if I have a high average daily gain and my forage is alfalfa? So I have a low versus a high with a high protein forage. Okay? In US genetics now, does the mammary development get compromised. And what they showed was that no, it does not. In this case, the ratio of protein to energy, in terms of grams of crude protein to megacalorie of metabolized energy, was 83. Now, in US genetics, when they made heifers grow at a high rate, but the base diet was corn silage in which the ratio of protein to energy was quite low, then yes, they compromise mammary development at that stage. Okay? So when people looked at this, they said, well, if I don't compromise mammary development, maybe if I make them grow faster, even with the US genetics today, but if I feed enough protein, I might be able to overcome the problem. So let's look at an experiment that they did this. This is an experiment that was done in the state of New York in commercial farms in which they fed heifers to gain on average this much, and this much. So about 1.6 pounds per day, about 1.9 pounds per day, and about 2.1 pounds per day. Okay? So what happened to those heifers? When they grew at a faster rate at that stage, they produced less milk. And all of these diets were adjusted for the ratio of protein to energy. About 63 grams of crude protein per every megacalorie of metabolizable energy. They produce less fat-corrected milk in that first lactation. We don't necessarily know what happens subsequently after the first lactation. But even if we were to feed high protein diets to the heifers relative to energy, we're not able to overcome the milk loss that takes place because these heifers gain more weight than they potentially should during that stage of development. Okay? So how much less milk? So these heifers here average about, during that first lactation, close to 20, this would be 30 kilos, 66 pounds of fat-corrected milk from calving all the way to dry off. And here we're talking about 4 pounds less per day. So it would be about 1,200 pounds of milk, fat-corrected milk in that first lactation. So 6-7% less milk. So these are the data that Judd has put together in a publication in which he reviewed literature and he looked at different rates of growth for heifers. These are average daily gains. These are, this is about 1.4 pounds per day, all the way up to 2.3 pounds per day here. And you can see here that for this database, animals producing in that lactation by 305 days, approximately 18,000, 19,000 pounds. The optimum milk yield occur when they were somewhere here, okay, between 780 to maybe 900 grams per day. So somewhere here, 1.7 to 1.9 pounds per day. Once they went above that 1.92 pounds per day, they really lost milk. They lost milk, and they really lost fat-corrected milk in that first lactation. Okay, so now basically, to gain more weight, you spend a little bit more money, yeah, because you don't gain an extra half a pound per day for free, either because you fed more, but most likely you fed a better diet, which is probably more expensive per pound. But now you didn't gain any additional milk. In fact, you lost milk. So you have to pay attention to that. They may look beautiful, but they don't necessarily give you more milk in that first lactation. In fact, they actually give less milk in that first lactation. And he just shared data that doesn't matter whether you're talking about a Holstein or a genetics for less potential, that response relative to the optimum is very similar, correct, Judd? So they all drop once you pass that, regardless of the genotype, but each genotype will have an optimum rate of growth. And it turns out that it seems that for the Holstein, it's somewhere here in that stage of life of 1.8 to 1.9 pounds per day. Okay. But there are some other advantages of formulating diets for adequate protein to energy. Okay? And I'll show you two pieces of data from Penn State work. One is that as we have additional protein relative to energy, okay, in the diet, so we don't feed a feedlot type of diet. We provide additional protein. We don't feed a low-quality forage with just urea, for instance. Feed efficiency gets better. Okay, so you need less feed for gain, and the animals develop more skeletal structure. So withers height and hip height increase if you provide sufficient protein. And I think this makes biological sense, yeah? To grow muscle, you require protein and requires energy to convert feed into lean tissue. So you need a certain ratio of protein to energy to have adequate skeletal growth. So some of the recommendations, okay? So adjust your average daily gain at that stage of life to aim 1.8, 1.9. You know there will be quite a bit of variability. There will be animals that will be gaining only 1.5, and there will still be animals gaining 2.2, 2.3. But and that happened also in the experiments, yeah? No experiment was perfect that every heifer gained 1.8. There's variability in there, but within the variability, these animals here, they outperform the other ones. Okay? So typical diets will contain this amount of energy for that kind of growth. Okay? So we don't need to get into those details. You need to provide enough protein, but you don't need to feed excess crude protein. And you need to pay attention whether you're gaining microbes, what Judd just said. And your nutritionist will work with you on that. But you don't need to feed extremely high proteins. But it will make a difference whether you feed better quality protein, particularly for the earlier, younger heifers. So keep this thing in mind. There is certain value of amount of protein to energy in the diet. And here are just some recommendations. But there is a certain need of protein for the amount of energy to build typical tissue of those animals, so you don't gain just adipose tissue. Make sure you supply ionophores, because the benefit to cost is extremely favorable. So somewhere in the 6 to 8 to 1 ratio. For every cent you spend, you get that much back. Target growth. So these are mostly for Holsteins. Okay, so you have to change that. But I think it's still a viable suggestion to double body weight by 60, 65 days. This is a really good indication that you have healthy calves. They are not facing a lot of disease. So by 60, 65, your calves will be 180 pounds. Based on the literature today, there is no advantage of having extremely heavy calves above this in terms of milk yield. There's really no relationship between overfeeding calves to get them at 210 pounds. You get zero milk back in their first lactation. Okay? Your calves should have high rates of gain up to this 3 to 4 months of age. Take advantage of grain intake to accelerate development of that calf. During that pre-pubertal phase of 3, 4 months all the way to breeding, make sure you don't overfeed heifers so they don't gain excessively, because there is a risk of losing milk production and spending more money in terms of developing those heifers. Okay. Now, once you reach the post-pubertal period, or when once the heifer is in the breeding group all the way through calving, okay, you can have more accelerated growth, but then it's a fine line between how much they grow and how much body condition they accrete. So yeah, we can make these heifers to grow very fast, and they will grow, 2.5, 2.6 pounds per day. It's just a matter of what diet you offer. The issue is that you don't want to have them over-conditioned at calving. So each producer will have a preference, and they will make a decision on how they want to grow those heifers. But you do want to have an adequate body weight at calving. So if your heifers are underdeveloped at this point, there's going to be catch-up to take place here. And at that stage, I can guarantee you they're not going to grow in frame size much more. You miss the opportunity to grow frame size. They're going to deposit more body fat, subcutaneous and internal body fat. Just quickly, some guidelines. You know, ideally, in the ideal world, these heifers would have a body condition score of 325, 350, more in the 350, otherwise you don't have adequate weights unless you have really tall heifers, okay? But once they get close to calving, we want to make sure they don't have excessive body fatness. And in general, it's much more common to have overconditioned heifers than have overconditioned cows. That's the common thing, because we want to have adequate weight. And if we're making heifers calve very young, quite often the observation, it doesn't need to necessarily to be like that, but the observation is that many heifers will have body condition score of 4 or greater, where they're flat in the back. Okay. But by the time they get to calving, they should be approximately at 90% of the mature body weight until the recommendation changes or new data comes along. So they're going to be here at for a typical Holstein, 1350, 1380, approximately 620 kilos. So you want your heifers to be looking like this. They are a U between the ilion and the head of the femur and the ischion, or they are a U with it not completely covered in the tail head here, and you can still see the sacral ligament in those animals. Okay, so if they are within this range, if they are a U here, they are greater than 3, and if they don't have a flat butt, they are less than 4.25. So it's quite easy. You can easily walk through your heifers and see that, and that's where you want your body condition to be in those animals. So just quickly, I'll go through two other concepts very quickly. These are data from the Department of Agriculture, from the portion of the USDA that controls all the phenotypic information that you guys use to buy semen and the AI companies use to do bull selection, and the pharmaceutical companies use for genotyping, et cetera, et cetera. What I have here are different traits. I just pulled different traits from the USDA database. Okay, so I have milk, fat, protein, productive life, somatic cell score, daughter fertility, DPR, and body composite as a proxy for stature. In the reds here, I have what's called a genetic correlation. Okay? So if two traits are correlate genetically, it means that they have common genes that control both of them. Okay? The genetic correlation can be from -1 to +1. Any negative number means that as one trait goes up, the other goes down. They are inversely correlated. Okay? Here is the heritability of that particular trait. Okay? You can see here that milk for the Holstein breed, fat, and protein are highly heritable. So you gain that. You can change that quickly as you use superior sires. You can see that fertility and fitness traits are not very heritable. The latest estimate's about 2-point-something% for the Holstein breed for DPR, meaning that if you use good bulls, it's going to take a long time until your genetics change. Okay? But what I have here on the bottom is the phenotypic correlation. I go to your farm, collect body weight, and measure milk. And I look at the relationship between the two. And I don't know anything about the genetics. Okay? So my point here is that look at body composite and milk. This is the genetic correlation. What is it? Can you guys see from the back? It's positive or negative? Negative. It means that if you just select for milk and you don't look at anything anymore, you just get the best bulls, you get 30 bulls every year, and you just look at milk, in the long run, your cows will be smaller. Genetically, they will be smaller. Okay? Now let's look at fertility. Can you see the number? It's quite small now. The relationship is weak, but it's still negative, meaning that if you select for anything that you can measure, daughter fertility, somatic cell count, how many more months she produces milk relative to the average, how many more pounds of protein, fat, they are all negative. So my point here is that if you select for things that are important, your cattle should not get larger. Now, look at the phenotypic relationship now. What are they? So if you look at milk and body composite, fat and body composite, are they positive or negative? They're positive, meaning that people that raise better heifers They get more milk and usually they are larger size. Okay? But it has nothing to do with the genes of that animal. Okay? If I ate more protein, I would never be the size of Shaquille O'Neal. Forget it. Yeah? He's this tall. Sometimes we think that if we just feed more, we're going to get a heifer that's this big. It's not going to happen. There is a gene that controls how tall, how big she's going to be. And even if Shaq never ate much, he would still be much taller than me. Correct? His shoe size is 23, mine is 12 and a half. Okay? So think about this. I could eat as much protein when I was growing up. My mom could feed me as much milk, and I would still not be as tall as he is. Okay? But if I were underfed, I would probably be smaller than I am today. But there is a limit relative to my genetics of how tall I can be. So if I take care of my heifers, yes, they are going to grow better. But I shouldn't be thinking of selecting for taller animals because I do not gain more milk. If I were to select for body composite in the long run, I would lose milk, fat, protein, productive life, fertility, and somatic cell. Let me show you another example. Look at what composite traits you pay attention when you're buying semen. Unfortunately, breeds like to keep certain types, yeah, because that goes into shows, and producers like good-looking cows. And this changes constantly. These composite traits will change over time. But this is the Holstein composite traits called total production index. Any dairy producer should never look at that, in my opinion, to be very honest. Although if you were pure breed producers, I would not say that here, but you should not look at that. Why? Because if you look at how much of the TPI is something that has nothing to do with how long she's going to produce milk, how healthy she is, and how much milk she's going to produce, is a much larger component than net merit, lifetime net merit. We're talking about 26% versus 16%. And probably lifetime net merit should be 0 here. Okay? Because if a cow is good with her feet, she's going to milk longer, she's going to get pregnant, okay? Now let's look at, I pulled the top Holstein sires, top 100 Holstein sires. It's been a few years, this. And I look at what would have been some of the values for type, stature, and some of the composite traits. If I just go there in the CDCB database and I pull the top 100 Holsteins for total production index, what is the PTA value for their daughters, okay, in terms of height? They're going to be taller daughters. Okay? If we use this as a guide to buy our semen, they're going to be bigger animals. Then I look at the top 100 Holstein sires based on net merit, which puts less emphasis on type traits. And if I were to buy the top 100 Holstein sires, on average, our heifers will be close to the average Holstein heifer of today. We're not going to grow them any larger. Okay? So don't buy semen just to get bigger. Forget about frame size, dairy type. Any good dairyman will tell you that that has no value in terms of how good those cows will be, how productive, how quickly they'll get pregnant, so on and so forth. This is an experiment we did many years ago. We start breeding heifers, we synchronize them with prostaglandin at different starting points. These dairies fed those heifers exactly the same way. So no heifer was fed different to gain more or less weight. Okay? The only thing we did was to make them become pregnant sooner or later, starting earlier or later. And these farms, they fed heifers to calve at about 23 to 24 months with about 1350 body weight. That was the plan. Okay? But we made heifers to calve younger, starting about 20 to 20.5 months, in which the average was 22, 23 and a half, or we made heifers calve later, 26 months. And we cut the ones from each of those groups that didn't fall within the expected program, because not every heifer gets pregnant when you want, when you start synchronizing. What happened was that in those farms, that the feeding program was designed to have a certain rate of growth. The ones that start calving at a younger age, at about 20.5 months to get this, they produce less milk in their first lactation. So they're peaking here at about 80 some pounds of milk, 84 pounds of milk, 38 kilos. And these heifers here are producing about 3 pounds less per day, so about 900 pounds less in that lactation. That's the first thing. Second one is that calving later, you don't gain anything, you just waste more money. Okay? Third one, and I'll finish, is that perhaps because they were fed the way they were, these heifers that calved at 20, 21 months, obviously they were lighter. They were 1,200 pounds, 1,250. Reproduction in the first lactation was less. They become pregnant slower. Everybody is open here. Voluntary waiting period ends here about 50 days. We start breeding. The line with the solid squares drop faster than the other lines. And you can see what happens here. The heifers that calve at starting about 22 months with an average of 23 and a half, they became pregnant about 12 days sooner than the other two groups. So if you have a feeding program that is to get a heifer at 23 months to calving, but you now decide to feed the same way, but you make them calve at 20 months, yes, you save 2 months of feeding, but you may lose quite a bit of milk in that first lactation.